Welcome r/nuclear revenge. Always have a backup. This happened over a decade ago now. I would have been 15 or so at the time. I was in my sophomore year of high school and this all takes place in my general science class for the year. Things started off quite well in that class with a nice teacher who was passionate about her topic. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, a good 6 weeks later classes were shuffled and we ended up with a new teacher. Our new teacher was an older guy, certainly less passionate and kind of dull but otherwise harmless. To provide a little background, I was certainly a troubled student in high school, and troubled is putting it lightly. I was a great student providing the teacher wasn't disrespectful and was actually interested in what they were teaching. There was nothing worse for me than a grumpy, bored and disrespectful teacher. Now the second gentleman was certainly bored and maybe a tad grumpy sometimes, but I wouldn't say he was necessarily disrespectful. He wasn't a good teacher, but he wasn't terrible either. He didn't ignite my passion for the subject by any means, but he was adequate. Then, for the second time that year, things got shuffled around on us, and we were on our third teacher. This time, a brand new teacher at our school, a recent immigrant from the UK. We'll call her Mrs. Snow. She was middle-aged with reddish hair and a scowl so cold she could extinguish the sun. Mrs. Snow got into a routine quickly. She made it very clear she would tolerate no misbehavior of any form, and included within the category of misbehavior was interruption. And this meant any kind. I observed several students, even well-behaved attentive ones, sent directly to the dean's office, a dean being someone who was essentially in charge of your year group, with no warning or prior offense for having the sheer gall to sneeze while she spoke, and it didn't matter how much you tried to cover it up. A friend of mine was unwell one day, but doing his best to make it through his classes. Unfortunately for him, he had quite a dry cough, and hell hath no fury like Mrs. Snow. Poor bastard was jettisoned before the class even had the chance to be seated. And of course, it should go without saying that I was not on her good books. She was rude, unreasonably hostile and clearly bored to tears by her subject. I don't recall how many lessons I saw to completion, but I certainly became intimately familiar with the dean's office that year. My favorite story to tell are the days when she was in a bad mood. As if she wasn't horrible enough already. I remember more than once she kicked out the entire class. God knows what she spent the rest of the lesson doing, but I remember the poor receptionist in the dean's office. Her eyes practically bulged right out of her head as she saw a Congo line of 30-something students making their way to the office, all requiring to be written up by her and seen by the year's dean. I can't imagine she was too fond of Mrs. Snow either, but the dean came to the wonderfully well thought out conclusion that the students were clearly the problem, not the teacher. Now one day during class, I was seated near the front of the class, right next to the computer Mrs. Snow was using to deliver her wonderfully monotone lecture on God only knows what bollocks. I happened to notice a small red pen drive sticking out the front of the machine. While she wasn't looking, and most of the class was distracted, I bent down pretending to grab something from my backpack which was on the floor below my stool, but quietly reached over and pulled the drive from the computer and stuffed it in my backpack before anyone could notice. I don't know why I did it, just being a dick I guess. I figured it's just a pen drive, she can get a new one. Later that day, I plugged the drive into one of the PCs in a library to browse the contents. Various things related to her class were scattered throughout, but then something in particular caught my eye, her immigration documents. I took a short peek and discovered her visa was due to expire in only a couple of months, and that she had a new folder in which she was assembling her documentation for her next application. Oh shit, I thought. This flash drive was hot property. If she found out I had this, I would be in serious trouble. The obvious solution of quietly returning the drive never occurred to me. At first I removed the red sleeve from the drive hoping it would be unrecognizable. Even then, I was still nervous, so between classes one day I threw it on the roof of one of the buildings. And not a moment too soon, she'd found out, and someone had dobbed me in. I don't think I had ever been sent to the deans that fast in my entire school life. I was grilled, kinda like those CIA/FBI interrogations you see on TV. I didn't crack, denied all knowledge and responsibility. They conducted a search on my backpack and found nothing. Just as well I'd tossed it. I was incredibly well known to the dean at that point and I could tell she was more than ready to believe I'd done it, but she couldn't prove it. Nobody could prove it. It was all he said she said. So I was let go. I continued having classes with Mrs. Snow. She was incredibly hostile towards the entire class after that, but especially me. More than once during this time, I got sent to the deans for absolutely no reason whatsoever. The referral slip she sent me with always claimed some utter bullshit that never happened, and the deans would gobble that shit up eagerly. Until one day, we had a reliever. And the next day, and the day after, that reliever became our new permanent teacher for the remaining 2 months or so of the year. There was never any explanation as to why. Rumors began to spread, and eventually I learned the proper truth. The copy of her immigration documents on that pen drive were the master copy. She had no backups, hard copies or duplicates. NZ's immigration system is ridiculously pedantic, in that you need to resubmit all of the evidence from previous visas you've been granted again, when you apply for a new one. She no longer had any of it. She was missing crucial documentation to retain her visa status, and as such, her visa was declined, and she left, or was removed from the country. I had no reason to suspect she wouldn't have backups. Usually you'd use a pen drive as backup, and have a master copy on a computer somewhere. This was in the days before cloud storage was a thing, and pen drives were quite small in capacity, and not particularly reliable at that. I remember having a few die on me during those years. Besides, what if you lost it? Anybody could poke through your crucial documents. It just seemed so unlikely that this would have been the case, and it's what I had assumed when I tossed the thing. But I was wrong. And she was never seen again. And that's the story of how I, accidentally and coincidentally, got one of the worst teachers ever, not only out of my school, but removed from my entire country. Remember kids, always have a backup. TL, Doctor, got a really shitty teacher who was nasty and horrible. Unknowingly stole a flash drive of hers, and finding it contained immigration documents I certainly shouldn't have been in possession of, I disposed of it. Turned out, she had no backup, and her visa renewal was declined. She vanished, and we all lived happily ever after. Edit. Hello all. To clarify/expand upon a few points, a few people have pulled me up on my Reddit account, being several years old, despite me saying I'm quite new. I registered it quite a long time ago. I don't remember why, but I haven't actively used Reddit in any way until maybe a month or 2 ago, and this is probably the first topic I've created. To clarify, I was just being a little shit and stealing a flash drive. I had no knowledge of what was on it until later. I was also quite severely mentally ill in high school, and this was quite some time ago. It wasn't as understood nor tolerated as it is now. I didn't know why I was feeling the ways I was. I didn't know why I was acting it. It was a turbulent and horrible few years for me. When I saw the documents on the drive, my first thought I shouldn't have this, and I cannot be caught with it. I had no way of knowing she had no backup copy, and perhaps assumed having other copies of something as important as that would be common sense. As no point was my intention to have her deported, it was more just a small thing that, due to a number of circumstances, many of which were beyond my control, snowballed completely out of control, and led to that. I have considerable regret that my actions caused her deportation, particularly more so as I've grown older. She was a horrible human being, but she didn't deserve that. It's something I wish never happened. I don't think a single person, staff, or student alike, missed her. I seem to recall some seniors throwing a party over it. I remember one of my teachers that year was asked about it by another student. She kept quite tight-lipped about the whole thing, but she struggled to hide her smile. Writing could have been a bit better, I know, but I typed this out while I was bored at work, so kept leaving and coming back to it, and didn't really have my full attention on it at any time. It sure seemed that way. I had another teacher, also from the UK, who taught the food component of home economics. She was firm and strict, much like Mrs. Snow, but she wasn't disrespectful, and she was actually good at what she taught. I never had an issue with her, and despite her not being all that well loved around the school, I actually quite liked her classes. I learned much from her. Mrs. Snow? I don't think I learned a damn thing. I don't think anybody did. That class scored very low on the end of year assignments that year. My math teacher in 8th grade was completely inept. She spent more of our time on the field than learning Algebra 1. She was moved to being a gym teacher the next year, after the previous one had been fired for scratching a kid across the face with her giant granny nails. In 6th grade, the other gym teacher was fired for assaulting a boy in the locker rooms for no reason I can remember. That was the year a kid climbed the school, fell through a skylight, sued the school for his being up there in the first place, and won. Exton Middle School was fucked up. Peas. I don't know if the story is fully nuclear. It was accidental. It wasn't completely illegal. It was more still revenge, but not this caliber.